Hello and welcome back to the Deep Dive. I want to try something a little different to start us off today.
Okay.
I want you to physically transport yourself. I mean, forget where you are right now, your commute, your office, your couch, whatever.
Get out of your own head.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I want you to close your eyes. Imagine you've just woken up, but your internal clock it's all wrong.
That disoriented feeling.
Yeah. It's dark out.
Yeah.
You check your phone, and it's, let's say, 3:30 in the morning.
Ugh, that specific awful time where the night is definitely over, but the morning hasn't even thought about starting yet.
That's the one. And you step out of your hotel room, maybe onto a little balcony or just onto the sidewalk.
Yeah.
And the first thing that hits you isn't the view.
No.
It's the air. And if you've ever been to the tropics, you know this feeling. We're in Tainan, in the south of Taiwan. The air is thick.
It's heavy.
It's heavy. It's sticky. It feels like it wraps around your skin like a wet blanket almost
Yeah.
immediately.
It's a very visceral thing. It's not just temperature, it's pressure. In Tainan, the humidity is, it's almost a physical character in the story. It really clings to you.
Right. And normally, when I step into weather like that,
Right.
hot, humid, sticky, my body just screams for ice water.
Right. Or air conditioner.
Or air conditioning, cold salad. I just want to escape the heat. But we're here today to talk about a phenomenon that completely flips that biological instinct on its head.
Completely inverts it.
Because in this specific city, at this specific ungodly hour, that humidity somehow triggers a craving for something heavy,
Something rich.
something boiling hot,
Yeah.
something kind of dangerous and raw.
And it sounds so counterintuitive, but physiologically, in those really intense tropical climates, there's a long history of seeking out caloric density and heat. It
Right.
helps regulate the body's equilibrium. It's almost like a grounding mechanism.
And that grounds us right in our topic. We aren't just talking about a midnight snack here. We're talking about what I honestly think we have to call a cult.
A cult.
The midnight beef soup cult of Tainan. And I really don't use that word lightly.
Cult feels dramatic, but when you look at the behaviors that we're going to discuss, the rituals, the absolute rigid adherence to timing, the social codes it kind of fits.
Right.
This isn't just about nutrition, it's about a form of devotion.
Devotion is a good word for it. But I have to play devil's advocate for a second here.
Go for it.
Because when I first started reading through our stack of research for this, my first thought was, okay, come on, it's soup.
Oh. Laughing slightly. Fair enough.
I mean, I love food, I do. But are we really saying that a soup eaten at 4 in the morning is fundamentally different from the same soup eaten at noon?
That is the million-dollar question.
Is this just like hipster gatekeeping? Is this just locals messing with the tourists?
And if we were talking about almost any other dish in the world, a burger, a pasta, a taco, I would probably agree with you. Taco at noon is pretty much the same as a taco at midnight.
Sure.
But the Tainan beef soup is biologically different.
Biologically different. Okay, hold on.
Yes, we are absolutely going to dig into the chemistry today, but the headline, the main takeaway is this. If you eat this soup at noon, you are eating a chemically different substance than if you eat it at 4:00 a.m.
Whoa.
And that difference is why people are willing to stand on the sidewalk sweating in the middle of the night.
So you're telling me there is actual science backing up the snobbery?
The snobbery is rooted in biochemistry, yes.
All right, I'm listening. But before we get to the chemistry of the cow, we need to talk about what I call the Google Maps problem. Because this is something that trips me up every single time I travel. I land in a new city, I pull up the app, I look for 4.5 stars and up,
The standard travel algorithm.
and I look for open now. That's the key.
Of course, convenience.
Exactly. I prioritize convenience. I want a place that's open when I'm hungry.
Mhm.
I want a place with an English menu so I don't accidentally order, chicken feet again.
A noble goal. And you want air conditioning.
I definitely want air conditioning.
And that exact approach, the convenience-first mindset, is precisely why most tourists in Tainan fail. They fail to experience the actual culture.
How so?
Because the phenomenon we're discussing today, this whole beef soup culture, it fundamentally rejects your convenience. It doesn't care about your jet lag.
It doesn't care that I want lunch at 1.
It doesn't care about your lunch schedule at all.
So the research we have here suggests that if you walk into one of these famous beef soup shops in Tainan at 1:00 p.m., which is a totally normal, reasonable time for lunch, you have already lost.
You've missed the event entirely. The shop might be open, sure. They might even serve you a bowl of soup. But the locals, the ones looking at you,
Yeah.
they aren't looking at you with jealousy. They're looking at you with pity.
Like, oh, look at the poor tourist eating the The dead meat.
Precisely. And this brings us to a concept that came up in our prep, which I think really frames this whole deep dive. It's this idea of neo-authenticity.
Neo-authenticity. That sounds a bit academic. Break that down for us. How is that different from just, regular authenticity?
Well, think about traditional authenticity in travel. Usually that gets co-opted by the tourism board, right? It becomes the cultural village where they do a traditional dance at 2:00 p.m. and 4:00 p.m.
Right. It's scheduled. It's a performance.
It's the Michelin-starred restaurant that creates a perfectly curated, consistent experience for every visitor. It's all designed to be accessible. It's designed for you.
It's a show. It's staged.
Exactly. Neo-authenticity, in this context, is the opposite of that. It moves beyond the staged performance. It's about engaging with a city on its own biological clock.
Its own biological clock.
It's about these raw, time-sensitive rituals that happen whether you are there to see them or not. It's the difference between seeing a play and, say, stumbling into the actors' rehearsal room at 3 a.m. while they're sweating and arguing and figuring it out.
I love that distinction. So we're not looking for the polished, finished version of Tainan. We're trying to find the raw nerve of the city.
And the stakes are high because the locals are incredibly protective of this ritual. They know the difference between the show for tourists and the reality for them. And that reality, it only exists in the dark.
So let's get into that reality. Let's dig in. We've established that eating at noon is for amateurs.
At best.
We've established that even 6 a.m. is pushing it. It's late. We are targeting the witching hour.
We are. And the central conflict here, as you said, is convenience versus freshness. But we really need to redefine freshness.
Right. Because if I go to a high-end steakhouse, in New York or London, fresh usually means the opposite of new. It means aged.
Exactly. Dry aged for 28 days, 45 days, 60 days.
The older the better sometimes.
Right. In the entire Western culinary tradition, and even in modern Taipei or Tokyo, quality beef is almost always aged. The animal is slaughtered, the carcass is hung, chilled, butchered, packaged, transported.
It's a long process.
It's a long process, and the goal is stability. By the time you see that steak in the butcher's case, it is biologically stable. The cellular processes have all stopped.
It's dead. I mean, obviously it's dead, but it's chemically inert.
Ideally, yes, it's preserved. But in Tainan, they have a completely different definition of quality. They don't want stable. They want volatile.
Volatile. That's a fascinating word for food. And the term I kept seeing in all the notes is Wen-ti Niu.
Wen-ti Niu.
It sounds so elegant, but the translation is actually kind of gnarly.
It is.
It literally means warm body beef.
It is visceral, and it's meant to be. This is not a metaphor. When they say warm body, they mean the thermal energy of the living animal has not yet fully dissipated from the muscle tissue.
Okay, stop there for a second. Because my food safety brain is just flashing red light.
I'm sure it is.
You're telling me this meat hasn't been chilled at all?
Correct. It has never touched ice.
Yeah.
It has never seen the inside of a refrigerator.
How is that safe? We're in the tropics. It's 80 degrees and 90% humidity. Isn't that just a bacteria factory?
In a standard supply chain, absolutely would be incredibly dangerous. But this brings us to the logistics of what you could call the hot chain.
The hot chain.
We are so used to the cold chain, keep it cold from the slaughterhouse to the plate to stop bacteria from growing. Tainan operates on a hot chain. The safety mechanism isn't temperature control.
It's what?
It's speed.
It's a race.
It is a flat-out sprint. The time between the animal being alive and the meat being in your stomach is so short, so compressed, that bacteria simply do not have time to colonize the meat to dangerous levels. We are talking about a window of just a few hours.
So the cow is the clock.
The cow is the clock, and this is why the tourist schedule always fails. If you treat this soup like a normal lunch, you are assuming the food is static.
That a steak is a steak is a steak.
Exactly, but Wen-ti Niu is dynamic. It is actively decaying, or rather changing by the minute, by the second even.
I read a quote from a shop owner who called the lunch meat the B team.
That's being polite, honestly. If you eat at noon, you are likely eating meat that was slaughtered at 2 a.m. but didn't sell during the morning rush. It's been sitting out.
Or it's been refrigerated.
Or it's been refrigerated, which to a Tainan local is dead meat.
Yeah.
It has lost its vital energy, its kwai, if you will. The magic, it's gone.
It reminds me of those exclusive clubs with the velvet ropes.
Yeah.
You try to get in, and the bouncer just looks at your shoes and says, nope, not tonight.
That's a great analogy. It's a perfect analogy.
But here, the bouncer isn't checking your shoes, he's checking your watch. And if you show up when the sun is high in the sky, you are not getting into the VIP section.
You're not getting in at all. And the club closes when the sun comes up. That's the real kicker.
Let's talk about the early bird fallacy, because I have to admit, I felt personally attacked by this part of the research.
I think we all do.
I'm the guy who wakes up at 6 a.m. on vacation and thinks I'm a hero. I'm patting myself on the back like, look at me beating all the crowds.
You're up before all the other tourists.
Right. But in Tainan, at a beef soup shop, 6:20 a.m. is basically the afternoon.
It's practically closing time.
That's humiliating.
Well, by 6:00 a.m., the first round from the slaughterhouse, the absolute prime delivery, is gone. It has been sold and consumed. You are number 45 in line. You are getting the scraps of the true experience.
So if 6:00 a.m. is too late and noon is a complete joke,
Yeah.
we need to take the listener to the actual time. We need to go to 3:30 a.m.
The witching hour.
I want to paint the picture of this supply chain because it is just fascinating. It all starts in the Kigo district.
Right. Kigu is the hub. It's on the outskirts of the city, and this is where the slaughterhouses are.
Now, we shouldn't be picturing some massive industrial factory farm. Right. At all.
These are smaller operations, and they're dealing specifically with a local breed of cattle called yellow cattle.
Yellow cattle. Is that significant? Why not use a Holstein or an Angus like you'd find in the West?
It's absolutely crucial. Yellow cattle are historically draft animals. They were used for farm work, so they have a different muscle structure. Much leaner, but the flavor profile of the meat is more intense, more beefy. If you tried to do this warm body technique with a really fatty corn-fed Angus, it might just be too greasy and rich. The yellow cattle have this specific endurance muscle quality that works perfectly for this kind of quick scald soup.
Okay, so it's 1:00 a.m. in Kigu. What is happening?
Controlled chaos. The slaughter begins. And you have to remember, there is no freezer truck waiting outside. There's no refrigerated logistics system.
So what is there?
There are taxis. There are scooters with insulated boxes strapped to the back. There are guys in beat-up old sedans.
Wait, the delivery fleet is literally just taxis?
Often, yes. Or private drivers. Because speed is everything. As soon as the animal is processed, these huge, warm, primal cuts are thrown into the back of a vehicle, and that vehicle just tears off into the night, heading for downtown Tainan.
It sounds like a bank heist getaway.
It feels like that.
But they're stealing beef.
They're not stealing it, but they are absolutely racing against a clock. They are racing against rigor mortis.
Okay, let's do the deep dive on rigor mortis here, because we all hear that term on, crime shows when they find a body. But what is actually happening in the steak?
This is the scientific core of the whole episode. So when any animal dies, the muscles initially relax, they go completely limp.
Right.
But inside the muscle cells, there is still a fuel reserve. It's called glycogen.
Glycogen. That's the energy battery for the muscle.
It is. The cells, on a microscopic level, are trying to stay alive. They are burning that last bit of glycogen to create ATP. That's the energy molecule. But because there's no more oxygen coming in from the blood, that whole process changes. The glycogen starts converting into lactic acid.
Acid. Okay, I'm with you.
And as that energy finally runs out, the muscle fibers, these two proteins called actin and myosin, they lock together. They essentially fuse solid. That is rigor mortis. That's the stiffness.
And stiff meat is tough meat.
It is unbelievably tough. If you were to try and cook a piece of meat that is in full rigor, it would be like eating shoe leather. It's inedible.
So normally, how do butchers fix that? How do we get tender steaks?
They wait. That's the whole point of aging. They put the cow in a chiller for a week, 2 weeks. They wait for the body's own enzymes to come in and decompose those locked fibers. They basically let the meat rot a little bit in a very controlled way to make it soft again.
But Tainan doesn't have time to wait a week.
Tainan doesn't have time to wait a few hours, so they cheat the system. They consume the meat before the lock happens.
That is the magic trick.
It is biological magic. You are eating the muscle in that tiny, precious window. It's about 4 to 6 hours long, where the glycogen is still breaking down, the enzymes are hyperactive, but the fibers have not yet locked together.
So the texture, it wouldn't be soft like a 45-day dry-aged steak?
No, not at all. An aged steak is soft in a way that can be almost mushy sometimes. This is lively. The description I've seen that's most accurate is it snaps, then it melts.
It snaps, then melts.
It has a structural integrity because it's so fresh, but it yields instantly to your bite because it's not stiff yet.
And what about the flavor? You mentioned lactic acid. Does that affect the taste?
That's the sweetness everyone talks about. This is so important. When people say Tainan beef soup is sweet, they aren't just talking about sugar in the broth.
They're talking about the meat itself.
The meat itself is sweet. That breakdown of glycogen creates a distinct, sweet, slightly metallic amino acid profile that completely disappears once rigor fully sets in.
So if I eat it at 9:00 a.m., that flavor is gone.
It's converted, the chemical reaction has finished, the meat is now just meat. It's tough, the magic is gone. You are quite literally eating the shadow of the dish.
Eating the shadow. That haunts me. It makes you realize that the flavor is actually a measurement of time.
It is. You are tasting time. It's a consumable moment.
So we've got the science. The taxi's made its getaway. It has arrived in downtown Tainan. It's 3:30 a.m. Let's go to that street corner.
Yes, this is my favorite part, the atmosphere.
Tainan at 3:30 a.m. isn't like New York or Tokyo. It's not the city that never sleeps. It's quiet.
It is dead silent. The neon signs for the shops that closed hours ago are just flickering. The scooters are all parked in these neat little rows. It's that liminal space between night and day.
And then you turn a corner, and it's like walking onto a movie set. There's this giant cloud of steam just rising into the dark sky, and there are people. A line of people.
The demographic mix is just fascinating. Who do you see standing in that line?
It's the wildest cross-section of society. You've got the old uncles, the opex in their white tank tops and flip-flops. They look like they've been doing this exact thing every single morning since 1970.
And they probably have. This is their ritual.
But standing right next to them, you have the club kids. You know, glitter still on their faces, smelling a little like whiskey, coming down from a long night of partying.
And then you have the third group, the serious foodies, the ones with the expensive cameras and the little notebooks, looking very intense.
It's this beautiful democracy of hunger. Everyone is equal before the cow.
And the sound, the sources all describe this rhythmic sound. Quack, quack, quack.
The cleaver. The sound of the cleaver on the wooden block.
Echoing off the concrete buildings and the quiet, it's hypnotic. And the smell, it's not just beef, it's ginger and iron.
Let's talk about the iron.
Yeah.
Because that brings us to the visual of the meat itself.
Yes. If you are used to supermarket beef, the meat on the cutting board at these stalls looks wrong.
It looks too red. It's not a bright cherry red.
No, it is a deep, dark, ruby red. It's almost purple in the dim light.
And it looks dry. That's the thing that really freaks people out. Usually if I put a raw steak on a plate, there's that little puddle of red liquid that forms under it.
People call it the drip. They think it's blood, but it's mostly water and a protein called myoglobin.
And why does supermarket meat drip like that?
It's because of the cold chain. When you freeze or even just deeply chill meat, the water inside the cells expands. It forms these sharp little ice crystals.
Okay.
And those crystals act like millions of tiny daggers. They puncture the cell walls from the inside out. So when the meat warms up again, the cell walls are all broken and all that liquid just leaks out.
It's like a deflated water balloon.
That is a perfect description. But Tainan beef, this warm body beef, it was never frozen, no ice crystals ever formed. The cell walls are perfectly intact, so all the moisture is locked inside the muscle fiber.
So the cutting board is dry.
The cutting board is bone dry. The meat itself is almost sticky to the touch.
That stickiness, is that the protein?
That is the protein and, the life force, essentially. The chefs say it adheres to the knife, it adheres to the plate. It is physically different matter than what you buy at the store.
Okay, so the owner takes this ruby red, dry, sticky meat. He slices it paper thin. And this is the part where the Western tourist usually starts looking around for the stove.
And there is no stove. Not for the meat, anyway.
He just puts the raw slices of meat into your bowl, just raw meat sitting there.
If you were to cook it in the big pot of broth, it would be ruined instantly. It cooks way too fast.
So he hands you a bowl of raw meat.
No, he takes a giant ladle. And this is a skill in itself. The stock in his pot has to be at a hard rolling boil, not just simmering. It has to be boiling.
Right.
Scoops up that boiling broth and he pours it directly over the raw meat in your bowl.
And that's the entire cooking process. That's it.
That is 100% of the cooking process. The thermal transfer from that boiling broth to the paper-thin meat cooks it instantly right there in your hands.
So it's dynamic. It's still happening while you're walking from the counter to your table.
You can physically watch the color change. You see it go from that deep, dark ruby to a soft, blushing pink in about 5 seconds.
And this creates a new kind of panic. Because now I'm stressed about time again.
You should be. The clock is ticking again.
My instinct is to, take a picture for Instagram. Or wait for my friend to get their bowl so we can eat together.
Do not wait. This is a critical, critical error. The meat is continuing to cook in the residual heat of that broth. Every second you spend trying to get the perfect photo, the meat is moving further away from its perfect state.
It's getting tougher.
It's getting tougher. You have to eat immediately. You have to dive in.
Let's describe the taste. We've talked about the science of the meat's sweetness, but the broth. Tainan is famous, or infamous, for being the sugar capital of Taiwan. People say everything there is sweet.
It is. Even the soy sauce is sweet. But in a master-level beef soup shop, the sweetness of the broth should not be coming from a bag of white sugar.
So it shouldn't taste like candy.
No, absolutely not. The best shops use a massive amount of fruits and vegetables in their stock base. We're talking about apples, onions, carrots, white radish, sometimes even whole stalks of sugarcane.
Wow.
They boil this for hours and hours to extract a very clean botanical sweetness.
So it's complex. It's not just a one-note sugar water.
It's essence.
Yeah.
It tastes like the pure essence of beef and vegetables. It's clear, but it has weight on your palate.
And when you take that first bite of meat that snaps then melts, texture you described, what is the realization that hits you?
The realization is that you are tasting something that cannot be replicated. You realize, in that moment, why a Michelin star rating is completely useless here.
That's a bold claim. Why can't Michelin rate this? They rate everything.
Because the core value of a Michelin star is consistency. A 3-star restaurant in Paris must be exactly the same today as it is next month, next year.
Right. Reproducibility.
But Tainan beef soup is inconsistent by its very design.
It changes every hour.
It is perfect at 4 a.m. It is very good at 6 a.m. It is mediocre by 8 a.m. It is fleeting art. It literally disappears with the sunrise. How do you give a star to something that only exists in its perfect form for 2 hours a day?
You can't. You just have to be there.
Scarcity creates the value. It's an experience, not just a product.
Okay, so we've convinced the listener. They've dragged themselves out of their comfortable air-conditioned hotel room. They're standing there at 3, 4, 5 a.m. They have the bowl in their hands. Now, we need to save them from themselves.
We need to talk about etiquette, because there is a trap waiting on every table.
The condiment trap.
You sit down at one of those little metal tables. You see it's covered in these stainless steel containers. You have a thick, sweet soy paste. You have freshly shredded ginger. You have chili sauce. You have vinegar.
And the instinct, especially for me, is, ooh, Flavor Town. I want to load it up. I want to dump a big pile of that ginger right into my beautiful clear soup.
And if you do that, you might see the owner physically clutch his chest in pain.
Why is it such a crime? It's just some ginger.
Think about everything we just discussed. You have traveled thousands of miles. You woke up at 3 a.m. You have paid for this incredibly delicate, enzyme-rich, naturally sweet meat. If you dump a pile of raw, pungent ginger and heavy soy paste into that broth,
You're just nuking the palate.
you are erasing all the subtlety. You turn a sophisticated, rare, time-sensitive experience into a generic ginger soup. You can get ginger soup anywhere in the world.
Okay, so what is the protocol? Walk me through the pro move. How do I do this correctly?
Step 1, look for the little stack of small, empty saucers. They are always there for this exact purpose.
Okay, saucer acquired.
Step 2, you build a side station, a dipping station. You put your ginger, your soy paste, your chili into the saucer, not the bowl.
Keep them separated, church and state.
Exactly. Step 3, and this is the most important, eat the meat plain first, at least the first 3 pieces. Close your eyes, focus on that texture, that snap, focus on that faint metallic sweetness we talked about.
Honor the cow.
Honor the cow and honor the insane logistics that got the cow to your bowl in that state. Then, and only then, you can move to step 4.
Which is?
You can take a piece of meat out of the soup and dip it lightly into the sauce on your saucer.
So the sauce is a contrast. It's not the base flavor.
It is purely for contrast, and you never ever dirty the broth. The broth should remain pristine and clear until the very last sip.
Okay, that saves the flavor. But I want to upgrade the order itself. I want to get the best possible meat. Because you mentioned in the notes that there's a kind of secret menu.
It's not written in English, and often it's not written on the menu at all.
That sounds like a video game cheat code.
It feels like one when it works. If you just walk up and say beef soup, you'll get the standard cut. It's usually from the leg or the round. It's lean, it's fresh, it's still fantastic.
But we can do better.
We can do better. The phrase you need to know, the one you should practice, is Hua-wen.
Hua-wen.
It translates roughly to flower pattern meat or sometimes snowflake meat.
That sounds like Wagyu.
It's the Tainan equivalent. It refers to the premium marbled cuts, the flank, the rib edge, the parts with beautiful intramuscular fat. But here's the catch.
There's always a catch.
There are only a few kilograms of this available per cow.
So one entire cow might only yield enough for, what, 5-10 people to get this special cut?
Maybe 20 bowls max. It sells out in the first hour of operation without fail.
So this is just a straight-up supply and demand problem.
It is, but it's also a social engineering problem.
Explain that. What do you mean?
The owners often save this special meat for their regulars. They know who's coming. They might even hide it under the counter. If you walk up looking like a clueless tourist, fumbling with your phone, they won't even tell you they have it.
They'll hold out on you.
They do. But if you walk up at 4 a.m., you make eye contact with the owner, and you confidently, clearly ask for Hua-wen.
You signal that you know the game. You're not just any tourist.
You signal that you are an insider. You appreciate the marbling. You understand the scarcity. Even if it's not officially on the menu, that nod, that shared understanding, that might be what gets you the good stuff.
It's like fake it till you make it, but for beef soup.
It's establishing credibility. And frankly, it's about respecting the craft. The owner wants that special meat to go to someone who truly understands what it is.
I love that. It's not just a financial transaction. It's a relationship, even if it's for just a moment.
Everything in Tainan feels like a relationship.
Which brings us to the bigger picture here. We've covered the how and the when and the what, but I want to land on the why.
The philosophy of it all.
Yeah, because look, I can hear some listeners thinking, this sounds incredibly stressful. Waking up at 3 a.m., racing against Rigor Mortis, secretly negotiating with butchers. Why would anyone do this?
If you view travel as just sightseeing, as collecting photos of famous buildings, then you're right, it makes no sense. It is completely irrational behavior.
Lies.
But if you view travel as syncing rhythms, it is the only way to travel.
Thinking rhythms. Unpack that for me.
Every city has a heartbeat, a metabolic rate. Most tourists only ever experience the city when it is awake for commerce, 9:00 p.m. They see the gift shops, they see the museums.
The sanitized, tourist-facing version.
Exactly. But Tainan's metabolic rate is different. The heart of this city beats fastest at 4 a.m. The butchers, the taxi drivers racing the meat across town, the soup masters boiling these giant vats of stock, they are performing a ballet in the dark.
A ballet in the dark, I love that.
It is this complex logistical dance that happens every single night while the rest of the island and the tourists are sound asleep. By participating in it, you aren't just an observer anymore. You are stepping into the flow of the city.
You're part of the machinery.
Exactly. You are consuming the city's true energy. And to go back to the science for a moment, because this soup is so time sensitive, you are literally consuming a moment in time. You are tasting a specific biological state that will never exist again once the sun comes up.
It's truly ephemeral.
It is. And that, to me, is what neo-authenticity is really about. It's not about finding the oldest building or the most traditional craft. It's about finding the most present moment. And in Tainan, the most present moment happens when that hot broth hits that raw meat.
It's the ultimate antidote to the curated, polished, Instagram perfect travel life.
It is.
It's messy, it's humid, it's exhausting, and it's completely real.
It demands effort from you, and that effort makes the reward, that first bite, so much more satisfying.
It really does. So here is the challenge for you, our listener.
Don't be a tourist.
Don't be a tourist. Don't sleep in. I know the hotel bed is comfortable. I know the AC is nice. But if you find yourself in Tainan, set that alarm.
Set it for 3:01 a.m., not 5:0 a.m., 3:0 a.m.
Feel the pain of that early morning. Embrace that sticky, heavy humidity on the sidewalk. Go stand in that line with the old men and the club kids.
Watch the steam rise up into the night sky, listen to the rhythmic chopping of the cleaver.
And earn that perfect bite. And please, for the love of everything holy, listen to our warning about the ginger.
Do not ruin the broth. The ghosts of the Tainan beef masters will haunt your travel.
They absolutely will. Now, we've mentioned some very specific things today. The hand signals, the look of the Hua-wen, the exact color of the raw meat. Audio is great, but sometimes you really need to see it to believe it.
You need to see that dripless cutting board to really understand the physics of what's happening.
Exactly. So we found a visual guide that pairs perfectly with this deep dive. Go to YouTube and search for TripMoment 520. That is TripMoment 520.
They break down the visuals just beautifully. You can see the steam, you can see the marbling, you can see the pure joy on people's faces at 4 in the morning.
It's the perfect companion piece. Check that out to prep your eyes before you prep your stomach. And hit that subscribe button on our feed too, because we have so many more hidden rituals and biological deep dives coming your way.
There is always another layer to uncover.
There always is. Until next time, keep your passport ready keep your mind open, and eat the meat before the sun comes up. This is the Deep Dive. Safe travels.
Safe travels.